Chapter 1. From the uncomfortable bridesmaid's dress, to her broken stiletto, to the fuming man in the car with her, everything about Collette Donaldson's perfectly planned weekend had gone terribly wrong. She darted a glance at Seth's profile. The edges of his jaw held as much warmth and softness as her cousin Emma's ginormous ice sculpture. "Why are you so mad?" Collette angled her body away from the ocean scenery passing by outside the window and toward the center of the car to get a better look at him. "I was the one humiliated." "I'm not mad." His gruff words said otherwise. Collette cocked her eyebrow. "Right. I'm watching the road." Focused straight ahead, Seth's eyes never wavered from the highway. Fine. He didn't want to talk. Message received. Maybe she couldn't blame him. Even though the discussion would do them good, she didn't really want to talk about how her cousin's wedding and their first weekend trip away together had spelled doom for their relationship either. Except the fact that Seth didn't want to talk about their problems was part of the problem. The man never wanted to talk about problems. He swept them under the rug, pretended they didn't exist, and then moved on as if nothing had happened. Maybe that method worked with minor annoyances, but not real issues, and not for long. Eventually, the problems would build until they erupted, like they had right in the middle of Emma's farewell brunch. He deserved an explanation about why her past had been thrown in his face like a bucket of ice water. Her father's words echoed in her head. "You deserve better than a labor hand." What Daddy had meant, of course, was that Collette should be dating one of his attorney friend's law school sons. Or, at the very least, she should have succumbed to her mother's insistence she dump Seth in favor of soon-to-be doctor Greg. Her parents meant well. They wanted her cared for and provided for. But she didn't live in a world like the ones depicted in all those Jane Austen books she read. She didn't need to vie for some rich guy she didn't like so she could snag an easy life as a trophy on his arm. She could take care of herself, marry whomever she wished. And up until this disaster of a weekend, she'd thought she'd known exactly who that guy would be, no matter what her father said. Another covert glance at Seth revealed he hadn't changed his stoic position. Collette sighed and rubbed her aching feet. "Where are we, anyway? Shouldn't we be on the interstate?" He shifted in his seat, but didn't look at her. "I thought the scenery this way would be better. Look, you can see the ocean." Collette stared at him. Why was he acting so weird? True, this morning's post-wedding brunch had ended with heated words, spilled mimosas, and her broken shoe. But rather than calming with each passing mile away from Houston, Seth only grew more anxious. "I'm sorry about what my father said. He can be terribly gruff." Collette held out the olive branch, hoping he'd take her peace offering. Seth gave a stiff nod. Seriously? One nod? After a year of dating, one terrible weekend was all it took for him to stop talking to her? Collette crossed her arms and stared out the window. Okay, fine. Her family had treated him poorly. Her cousin had made snide comments behind his back. Her mother had spoken to him as if he should be the hired help instead of her guest. This weekend had been important to her. Collette had wanted her family to like Seth. But she'd done nothing to defend him. Nothing to stand up against her parents. This disaster was all her fault. Tears burned in the back of her throat, and she had to swallow them down. She couldn't cry. Crying would only make things worse. She shouldn't have chosen such a stressful situation to introduce Seth to her family. Did he think she'd been ashamed of him, like her father had implied? They should have gone to Houston earlier. She just wanted everything to be perfect. Now, she wasn't sure if their relationship would survive the drive home. Seth gripped the steering wheel, his fingers aching and yet refusing to relax. The small black box in his jacket pocket felt like a boulder pressing on his chest. "I won't let you marry my daughter. Not until you pull yourself together." What Alton really meant was that he'd consider Seth's marriage to Collette when Seth accepted an accountant job with Donaldson, and Frey. He had a degree in accounting, yes, but he hated desk jobs. Had only spent 4 torturous years earning that scrap of paper to please his father. With Dad gone, Seth didn't think he'd ever go back to that life. Unless misery was the only way to keep Collette. But shouldn't she love him no matter what career he had? A man who wanted to work with his hands, start his own bricklaying company, rather than grow paunchy behind a desk? He thought this weekend would mark a new chapter in his life. Diamond already purchased, he'd expected to have the traditional talk with Colette's dad and secure the man's blessing on a wedding of their own. Instead, her father's refusal had led to bruised pride and words that shouldn't have been said, and ended in Collette stomping away from the family meal. At least she didn't know her father had denied Seth his blessing. He resisted the urge to grip the box in his pocket. Seeing the exit, he turned off the seaside highway and onto a quiet side street. The restaurant should be up ahead. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, stomach clenching. He had reservations, a plan. But with the way this weekend was going, maybe this was a bad idea. Collette rubbed her foot, annoyance rolling off her like heat from a kiln. How could this relationship have gone so wrong in such a short period of time? Did he even know the woman beside him? She'd seemed an entirely different person around her family. Would every holiday be that way? Would he be sentencing himself to a life of his in-laws constantly trying to undermine him? 6:45. 15 minutes until their reservations. And his girlfriend was wearing one shoe and had mascara on her face. Her long, honey blonde hair had half fallen out of the artful design she'd worn this morning. This morning, when their relationship had been taut, but not yet frayed. Now, he doubted she'd be receptive to the question he'd been excited about last week. One he now didn't think he should even ask. They'd have dinner. He glanced at Colette's stiff posture. But there'd be no proposal. Not like this. Not when all his plans had been run through the meat grinder. Neither of them was in the mood for romance. Him especially. His white Honda rolled down the street, as plain and mediocre as Colette's family saw him. Maybe Mr. Donaldson had been right. Seth wouldn't be able to provide the life Collette wanted. At least, not the one she craved deep down. Eventually, she'd grow tired of their cute little life and want to go back to the world of yacht clubs, society gatherings, and the big city. Lord, I sure could use a little wisdom, advice, some guidance. Maybe marriage should wait until... A loud bang shattered the tense silence. Collette screamed. The car jerked hard, and Seth gripped the wheel, pulling back to counter the skid. He guided the car onto the shoulder. They lurched to a halt. Collette grabbed the side of the door, her eyes wild. What happened? I think we blew a tire. Just what he needed. He thrust open the door and slammed it behind him. At least now he had his answer. Clearly, he wouldn't be proposing tonight. Hands looped behind his neck, Seth stared at the blown tire. Not good. At least he'd gotten to the shoulder before the rim was damaged. Seth rounded the car and popped the trunk. He lifted the cover on the bottom and stared, dumbfounded. Where was the spare? He could have sworn there'd been one in there when he'd bought the car. The empty hole mocked him. Seth slammed the trunk, rattling the car. He'd have to call a tow truck. He pressed his thumbprint on the button to awaken his phone. What? No service? He glanced down the picturesque little street. Live oaks dripped with airy moss that swayed in the increasing wind. Dark clouds gathered overhead, bringing an early dusk. Ocean Springs wasn't exactly a booming metropolis, but at least they weren't out in the sticks. He lifted the phone and angled it toward the sky. Nothing. Not even one bar. Just two little words, mocking him. No service. Jaw tight, he jammed the phone in his pocket and rounded the car, shoulder gravel crunching under his polished loafers. In the passenger seat, Collette frowned down at her phone. He knocked on the window. She glanced up at him and pushed the window button. When it didn't roll down, she popped open the door. We blew a tire, no spare. Her blue eyes rounded. You don't have a spare? The insinuation that he was an idiot dripped from her tone and sent snapping currents of irritation through his veins. The side of his lip curled. I did have a spare. And you don't now? She lifted one perfectly arched eyebrow, taunting him. I need your phone. Collette huffed. I don't have any signal. Of course she didn't. Seth clenched his fist, relaxed it, and clenched it again. No phone. He'd need to walk to a gas station and borrow one there. He glanced around. Picturesque houses with manicured lawns lined the quiet street. Farther down this road, he'd find the romantic little cafe with an ocean view and a table set with 24 red roses. What do we do? Collette asked. Seth turned on his heel and started in the other direction, back toward the highway and as far away from the restaurant as possible. Wait! Collette limped up beside him, one leg shorter than the other thanks to the broken sandal heel. What are you doing? Going to call a tow truck. Her lips parted and she blinked at him. And you were going to leave me here? Alone? Seth gestured to the quiet street. This wasn't a dark alley filled with muggers. You can wait in the car. Lock the doors. I'll be right back. Her nostrils flared in that way they did whenever she got mad at him. Collette stomped back to the car. Seth turned and started down the road. Maybe he should knock on one of these doors and ask the person inside for a phone. Behind him, the car door slammed. Thunder rumbled overhead. Great. Could this day get any worse? Rocks crunched behind him. His shoulders tensed. Collette gained his side, walking with the determined, though decidedly uneven, gait. I told you I'd be right back. I'm not going to wait out a storm in a car. She flung her arm to the nearest house. Why in the world would you walk past all these people to get to a gas station? Without a word, Seth pivoted and marched up the brick sidewalk to the nearest house. He pounded on the door of the bungalow and then stepped back to wait. Collette stood on the sidewalk behind him, arms crossed. No answer. He waited another minute, though mostly to cool the hot blood pumping through his veins, and then turned and bounded down the steps. He knocked on the next 4 doors, all with no answer. Collette propped her fists on her thin floral dress. Where is everyone? They hadn't seen a car pass, and no lights flickered in the windows of the houses on the street. Weird for a Sunday night. He suppressed the eerie feeling tingling down his spine and grabbed Colette's hand. Raindrops splattered on his head. Collette groaned. But going back to sit in the car wouldn't do them any good. He couldn't help it if she got wet. He'd told her to stay in the car. Up ahead, a light flickered to life, illuminating a carved wooden sign. Scrolled letters in black paint decorated the face. The depot. Perfect. Probably some little B&B. They'd have a phone, and someone would have to be there. Seth pulled Collette along beside him, the rain picking up and dappling their clothing. The light glowed in the distance, beckoning him. Collette struggled along beside him, her awkward limp slowing them down. He almost scooped her up and carried her, but he knew she'd only protest. Stubborn woman. He slowed his pace to accommodate her, the rain now falling in a steady rhythm. Thunder rumbled again. The trees shivered in the cold wind, dropping more water on them as they passed underneath. They made their way down the sidewalk until finally reaching the sign. The bright floodlight cut through the rain. The depot. Step back in time and leave your troubles behind. Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Seth tugged Collette up the sidewalk. She jerked her hand free, and he stopped. Collette tilted her head back, shielding her eyes from the rain as she stared. What in the... Why was she standing in the rain? He turned to look at the inn. A massive Victorian, the kind with turrets, sweeping porches, and gingerbread molding, shone through the gathering downpour. Seemed like every light in the house glowed, calling them onward. Seth grabbed her hand again. Come on, you're soaked. She shook herself and hurried after him. They tromped up the stairs and onto the front porch. Collette gathered her hair in her hands and twisted it, depositing a puddle on the wooden floor. He knocked on the carved door. A moment later, it swung open to reveal a short woman in her mid-60s. Wearing a floral print dress trimmed in white lace and looking like something 2 centuries out of fashion, the woman greeted him with a warm smile. Hello there. The rain howled and spewed droplets onto the porch. The woman gestured for them to come inside. You're a little late. Best hurry inside. They were late? He must have misheard. She probably meant it was getting late. Our car broke down. Mind if I use your phone? Seth shifted his feet, depositing water on polished hardwood floors. Papered walls were bathed in the light of flickering glass globes held up by iron sconces. Apparently, the sign had been partly right. He'd certainly stepped back 2 centuries. You don't need a phone, dear. The woman smiled sweetly at him, a dimple forming on one of her cheeks. Didn't you read the sign? The sign? Did she mean the one with the corny logo? You don't have a phone? Not even for emergencies? Patting her upswept hair, the woman turned with a flare of her floor-length dress and motioned for them to follow. Well, perhaps we can find something, if it makes you more comfortable. He shared a glance with Collette. They needed a tow truck, not to play some stupid game of pretending they'd stepped back in time. They followed the woman through a set of massive pocket doors and into a room filled with squatty, pretentious furniture. She swept her hand dramatically toward an antique black phone sitting on a tall, thin table. Great. He'd chosen the one place in Ocean Springs without a conventional telephone, or a normal landlady with a cell phone. He picked up the small earpiece and rested it against his ear. Dial tone. The phone looked like a silver candlestick with a set of numbers positioned in a circular pattern along the right side. He fished his wallet out of his pocket and pulled out the card for AAA. Sticking his finger in the hole for the number 6, he pulled it down to the center of the dial and waited until it clicked back up. Dialing all 10 numbers would take forever. Behind him, Collette and the B&B woman talked in low tones, probably about the stuffy furniture or age of the house. Collette loved old houses. He preferred hotels that came with a pool and movies on demand. Finally, the last number clicked through and the line connected. After 4 rings, a friendly female voice answered. Roadside assistance, how may I help you? Seth gave the details of the circumstances and waited while the woman connected him to a local towing service. Behind him, Collette laughed about something. He'd always loved her laugh. Those times when she let her guard down and didn't try to maintain what her mother called a proper presentation. Debutantes. He inwardly rolled his eyes. So many rules. Tommy's Towing. How can I help you? Seth rattled off the details again, turning himself so he could see the women behind him. I'm sorry, sir. Can you say that last part again? Sounded like you dropped your phone. Or turned too far away from the ancient microphone thing on the top of the candlestick. He turned his back to the women again and leaned close to the mouthpiece. How did people ever hold decent conversations like this? After repeating his circumstances, the man on the line said, We can help you. First thing in the morning. In the morning? Yeah, sorry. Bill's out on a call already, and with a storm coming in. Y'all got a place to stay? Seth clenched his teeth and stared at the gaudy carpet under his feet. Are you sure you can't get someone out here? I don't even need a tow truck, just a spare tire. I'll change it myself. Sorry, sir. Wish I could help you, but morning's best I can do. He begrudgingly set up a time for in the morning, thanked the man, and hung up the phone. The woman in the dress pointed at paintings hanging on the wall around a fireplace, which had a carved wooden mantel and was inset with an iron coal-burning contraption. As though sensing his gaze, she turned. Did you find what you needed? Are there any tow services in town other than Tommy's? The woman shook her head. What about a tire shop? Her blue eyes filled with pity. Not that are still open, I'm afraid. Collette shivered. Mrs. Easley offered for us to stay here for the night. Of course she did, likely at a hefty fee. Thunder crashed, rattling the old windows behind lace curtains. What choice did he have? How much? 50 for each room. She smiled again. Not married, so you'll need two, of course. The word reminded him of the little box in his pocket. 50 a room was super cheap. How did this woman run a business with prices out of the mid-20th century? We'll take them, thanks. Collette scoffed. Aren't you even going to ask me? What? She'd suggested they stay. Blood pressure spiking, Seth forced his voice to remain calm, but he couldn't keep out the icy sarcasm. I'm sorry, Collette. Would you prefer to stay inside a creepy old house or spend the night out in the car in the rain? She gaped at him. He never talked to her like that. But the stress of the wedding, the drive, the tire, and now this, he couldn't find the energy to coddle her. Eyes sparking fire, Collette turned up her pert little nose and whirled away. She stalked out of the room. The woman, Mrs. Easley, regarded him with a knowing expression. Lovers spat? Seth sighed, his shoulders drooping. This isn't where we were supposed to be tonight. Mrs. Easley laughed. On the contrary, dear, you're exactly where you're supposed to be.